Project Communications is Unit 3, which is part of the SCQF Level 8 Diploma in Project Management awarded by EAL. In this video I'm going to go through the unit and explain how to gather evidence for this unit. Project Communications is a mandatory unit for the Project Management Framework, so all learners who are on this programme must complete this unit to pass the award. In the unit summary, it gives a description, explains that communication is the means by which information or instructions are exchanged. Successful communication occurs when the received meaning is the same as the transmitted meaning. Conflict management is the process of identifying and addressing differences that, if left unresolved, could affect objectives. Negotiation is a discussion between two or more parties aimed at reaching an agreement. This unit is SCQF Level 7 and there's 15 credits for completing this unit. It is recommended that this unit is assessed holistically and therefore left to the end, because when you're working on your other units that involve, all of that will involve communicating. So for example, if you're working on your schedule, your quality, your resource units, then a lot of the outcomes will require you to evidence various forms of communication, particularly with resources when it comes to negotiation over the acquisition of resources. So if you're gathering holistic evidence for those sorts of tasks, a lot of that will be able to be assessed and mapped into this communication unit holistically. This unit has 3 learning outcomes. The first is communicating with project stakeholders, the second is managing conflict, and the third is contributing to negotiations relating to projects. Looking at the first outcome and the first criteria, 1.1, identify the information needs of different project audiences. By project audiences, it means your stakeholders, so it's important to understand what information do your stakeholders require, particularly when it comes to putting together a communications management plan. Different stakeholders require different levels of information, and it will also be required to be sent in using a different method. For example, senior management might require high-level summaries, whereas someone completing a task or activity would require detailed information. Some stakeholders are familiar with project management methodology and some aren't, so those who are can get the detailed project management information. Those who aren't might require that information to be changed or adapted in a way that they'll understand it. Some stakeholders might have access to computers, some might not. So if you've got, for example, a tradesperson who's responsible for carrying out a task or activity, they might not necessarily have access to a computer if they're on site, so perhaps that would require a paper folder to be produced with the plans in place, and it can be communicated that way. So those are some examples. For this, reflect on a time where you are dealing with information about a project. How did you identify or create a communications plan? The key elements of a communications plan outlines what is to be communicated, who it's to be communicated to, when and how often it's to be communicated to, and how it refers to the method in which it's going to be communicated, whether that be electronically, whether it's an email, whether it's in a SharePoint site, whichever method you're using. That is the basis of a communications management plan. Who are the different audiences and what information does this audience or stakeholder require to access? Go through the information and for each explain out the communication plan. Product evidence for this could be your communication with stakeholders discussing information needs. 1.2 is prepare a communications management plan that addresses communications requirements. So this is you now taking all that planning together and you're producing a communications management plan. This could be in the format of a Word document or PDF document, or it could be a SharePoint site, or it could be put together using a tool in your project management software. Depends on what your organisation does. So for this, reflect on a time where you've produced a communications management plan. How did you produce the plan? What information was contained within the plan? Who are the stakeholders covered by the plan? And what methods are being used to communicate? Suggested product evidence for this could include a communications plan which you have contributed towards or put together yourself. Typically this includes a table or register and some commentary. Again, the basis of this is who, what, when, where and why. It's important to note here as well that you're not expected to fully produce this plan. It might be the case that you're merely contributing towards a plan that your team as a whole is putting together, and if so, that is fine to cover this point. 1.3, tailor messages and communication methods to meet different stakeholders' communication needs. As I've already mentioned, some stakeholders will require messages to be tailored or adapted, so reflect on a time where you've had to communicate with a group of different stakeholders. How did you tailor the communication method and information to suit the different stakeholders? Why was the communication tailored, and what was the outcome? What was the result of being able to tailor this information? Product evidence for this could include communication, so that could be digital communication such as an email, instant message, sharing a file on a shared drive, something like that, or it could be a letter or other written communication. 1.4, overcome barriers to effective two-way communication. This criteria is all about overcoming difficulties or setbacks when it comes to communication. This could include whoever you're communicating with not fully understanding the intention of what you were trying to communicate, not fully grasping what it was, not understanding the information, missing or losing the information. Could also include technical issues if the communication has been done over a digital means, maybe there's issues with the software, the internet connection or the equipment. So those are all examples of situations where there could be a barrier to effective two-way communication, although it's not exhaustive. Two-way communication refers to information where you're sending a message to someone else, they're receiving it, and then they're responding to you. Doesn't necessarily have to be just two people. It could be you communicating with a group of people and an individual of that group, or the group as a whole communicating back to you. The key thing is that message is being sent to the recipient is understanding it and then sending a response back to you. So for this, reflect on a time where you were communicating with someone and you faced a barrier to communication. What was that barrier? How did you overcome it, and what was the outcome? Product evidence would be digital communication, so some form of email, instant message, or meetings of minutes. Keep project stakeholders informed of issues and developments in line with the communications management plan. So this is about updating and changes to the project as your project goes on. This ties in with a lot of the other units. It's about monitoring and updating your various project management plans, and best practice would be to gather holistic evidence on this, which could then be mapped in to cover this point. So this is simply about any changes that's happened to a project, you've updated the documents, and then you've communicated out those changes to your stakeholders. So reflecting the time you've kept different stakeholders informed throughout the entire duration of your project. What was the development? What was the procedure outlined in the communications plan, and how did you inform stakeholders in line with the communications plan? Product evidence for this could include some form of digital communication where you're actively keeping them up to date, an updated communications register or plan, or it could be a reference to the communications plan which you've put together and which you're following. Moving on now to the second outcome, 2.1, identify factors that affect behaviour patterns in the choice of influencing methods. This outcome is about conflict management. Conflict is a good thing for a project in most instances. It's important to have some degree of conflict where there's competition for ideas to take things forwards. You don't want a team full of people who just nod and agree to the first suggestion. However, conflict can very easily spill into something that's negative when it gets too extreme, and that is something to be avoided. Project management is all about getting people to be on board with your project, to support your project, to be motivated, which will result in project success. If there are interpersonal difficulties due to some conflict that's happened, that could lead to people not being interested in the project and ultimately to project failure. So this is very important as a project manager. It's a key skill. First thing you want to do is identify factors that affect behaviour patterns and the choice of influencing methods. So you'd recognise the behaviour pattern of the person who is engaged in the conflict, and that would determine the choice of method that you'd use to try and influence them to resolve the conflict. So reflect on a time where you've experienced conflict. How did the conflict arise? What were the factors in increasing the level of conflict? What was the conflict management technique that you used? And what was the effect of this? What technique to use? How did you use it? And what was the effect? Product evidence for this may include analysis in your communications management. It could be Belbin or other management or leadership styles questionnaires. In these questionnaires, it outlines a number of different management or leadership techniques, and some of them might result in an increase in conflict or a decrease in conflict. It could also include responsibility or clarity. So people are clear, and there's clear documentation about what people are responsible for, and tasks that are clear what needs done. That will help to reduce conflict. So anything documenting that can be included as product evidence. 2.2, adapt your communication style and approach to conflict resolution to the personalities involved. So this is about you being self-aware and being able to evidence that you can be self-aware in an environment where there's some conflict going on. So you're aware of the impact that your presence has on another person. You're able to use appropriate body language, tone of voice, and word choice to help to reduce the conflict. So reflect on a time where you were resolving conflict. Go into a bit of detail about the context of the conflict, who was involved, what was it about, how did you change your communication style to suit the situation and what was the outcome of doing that. Product evidence for this can include some form of digital communication, which include email or instant message, letter or meeting minutes. 2.3. Analyse the links between project management, strategic management and business as usual. This one's a bit awkward to try and get an holistic statement. What this is about is understanding the role that each of these three things play. So strategic management is all about high level, long-term decision making. So strategic management will make a decision that they'll look into the future, say in 5 years' time we need this to happen. They'll then commission a project sponsor and a project manager to put together a project so that is in place within that time frame. Project management will then hand over the completed project to business as usual. Business as usual can be considered as the business's regular operation or operational team. So there's clear links between the three groups, and it's important that they are clear. Everyone knows what they're responsible for, and the communication is good between these three elements, because if there isn't, it could result in conflict. So what is project management? What is business as usual? What is strategic management? How are they linked within your project, and how might a conflict arise between these three elements? You might also be able to include evidence on a situation where maybe there's been some breakdown or some minor issue where and the difficulties around the links between these three elements. Product evidence for this may include digital communication, some planning documents outlining rules and responsibilities, or planning documents around preparing information for transition to business as usual. 2.4 follows on from 2.2, where you are resolving or reducing conflict by the application of appropriate conflict management techniques. So this is you now actively engaging with the people having a conflict and taking action to, first of all, calm them down and reduce the conflict, and then deal with the underlying issue that's caused the conflict so that it doesn't occur again. For this, reflect on a time where you've resolved conflict. What was the conflict about and who was involved in the conflict? What is the procedure outlined in the communications plan or organisational procedure for dealing with the conflict? How did you resolve that conflict? Product evidence for this may include a communication, so it could be digital communication such as an email, an instant message, Teams message, whichever system you use. Could be a report on the conflict that occurred, a case study, could be meeting minutes as well. 2.5. Identify the role of project planning, clear governance policies and effective communication in avoiding and resolving conflict. Each of these three things has a clear role to play in reducing conflict. Having an effective project plan means everyone knows what's expected of them, when tasks are going to happen, what standard they've got to be completed to, so people know what it is that they have to do and the expectations are clear. Clear governance policies is all about information management and change control, amongst other things, and having those key policies in place means that when there are changes, everybody knows that the change has been made, it's been approved by the correct person, so that not anyone can just decide themselves to make a change and not tell anyone else about it. It's very clear the procedure for making changes, and that can help reduce conflict when that process is clear. Effective communication as well, so if there is a change or if something's happened, it's important that the relevant stakeholders are aware of it in good time, otherwise they'll make decisions based on out-of-date information. So that's why communication is important. So a breakdown in any of these three things can result in conflict. This criteria is about you being able to identify, based on a situation you've been involved in the workplace, why these three things are important, and importantly you should try and cover all three items on the list here to cover off this point. For this, reflect on a time when you are managing conflict or involved in conflict. What was the conflict? What was the conflict management plan? What was the plan in place to reduce the conflict? What are the governance policies? What's the communication strategy? And what role did clear governance policies, project planning and effective communication have in either causing or avoiding this conflict? Product evidence for this can include your communications plan, which includes theory of conflict management, or a negotiation strategy plan including BATNA. Can also be communication about your negotiation strategy. Now moving on to the third outcome, which is about negotiations. There is a good link here between this outcome and one of the outcomes in the resource management unit. So if you are having a negotiation about the acquisition of resources, then holistic evidence should be able to be mapped into both of these outcomes. So if that's something you're doing, maybe have a look at that other outcome in the resource management unit. 3.1 is about identifying priorities, giveaways and fallback positions that are consistent with project activities. So this is the first step to planning your negotiations before you actually get involved in it. You need to plan out what's your priorities, what do you want to get out of these negotiations, what will you give to the other person or the other organisation in order to get what you want, to get your priorities. And your fallback position is the minimum you want to get out of this, otherwise you'll walk away and not reach a deal. These things, you need to be clear about these things before going into an organisation. So you want to evidence that you've been able to plan this out and come up with your priorities, giveaways and fallback positions. For this, reflecting the time, we've had to recommend a negotiation strategy. What was being negotiated? What were the issues? What's the wants and needs of everyone concerned? What's the fallback position? And what's your negotiation strategy? Product evidence for this may include how have negotiations been managed or approached? What are the negotiation aspects of your project? Could be your project plan, which is integrated with your stakeholder plan. It could be documentation identifying stakeholder priorities, giveaways and fallback positions, some sort of negotiation strategy document or communication plan with knowledge about your negotiation strategy. 3.2, recommend a negotiation strategy that identifies issues, including the motivations, wants and needs of everyone concerned. 3.2 is more about looking at what the other person or the other partner in the negotiation would like from them. So 3.1 is more about looking at what you want and your organisation wants. 3.2 is about looking at what the person you're negotiating with is looking for, to understand their motivations, their wants and their needs, because that can help you come up with ideas on how to be more successful. So if you give them what they want, they'll give you what you want. So you have to have some awareness of the other party in negotiations. For this, reflecting the time, you've had to recommend a negotiation strategy. What was being negotiated? What were the issues? What's the wants and needs of everyone concerned? What's the fallback position? And what's the negotiation strategy? Product evidence for this can include a strategy plan, detailing relevant information, including BATNA, negotiation strategy document, or communications plan with knowledge about negotiation strategy. So some document analysing the wants and needs and motivations of both parties in negotiation. 3.2, contribute to competitive or collaborative negotiations against plans and expectations, making recommendations to address departures and shortfalls. 3.3 is looking for you to evidence how you have contributed towards negotiations, and also not only just contribute towards them, but make any recommendations should there be any issues or problems or departures from your negotiation plan that you initially made. For this, reflecting the time where you're involved in negotiations. What were the negotiations about? How did you contribute towards negotiations? Why did you contribute in that way? What type of negotiation took place? And what was the outcome? Product evidence for this may include digital communication, such as an email or instant message, could be letter or meeting minutes. So some form of communication where you have been engaging and taking part in communication. If you're wanting to evidence that you have dealt with any departures or shortfalls, it could be any document which would reference that. 3.4, adhere to a logical sequence of negotiation phases. It's important that negotiations are done in a certain order. Negotiations aren't just done around price. The first thing, typically, particularly if it's a complicated project and if it's a key supplier, so a key part of your project, usually you want to do some investigation into your suppliers to ensure that they are safe to work with and that they can deliver on what they're promising. There's no point going with the cheapest supplier when it turns out they've not had the experience in delivering the resources that you require, because it could be a resource that's critical to your project and it'll be too late by the time you find out that they can't actually deliver the amount that they promised to deliver because it's the first time they've done it. So it's important to do research into your suppliers, and that would be the first step. You'd then maybe have some sort of initial conversation with them. You'd want to look into the resources that they're offering, make sure it's of the right standard, make sure they can deliver the right quantity, and then you'd maybe want to look at the technical specifications of the resources that you're acquiring, and then at that point you maybe start to get into discussions about dates and prices. And the last stage is reaching an agreement. So there's a set sequence, and it depends on the negotiation that you're doing, but you want to evidence that you want to have evidence about the order that you planned out the negotiations for your project. Product evidence for this may include a review of the negotiation process and highlight how you follow the steps during negotiation, or any evidence such as diary invites or emails, communications about how you have planned out the order of your negotiations. 3.6, record and negotiate outcomes and salient issues, communicating these to relevant stakeholders. So once your negotiations have been done, it's important that you communicate that to your stakeholders. For example, if you are negotiating around the acquiring resources, there will be stakeholders working on your project that will be using those resources, and they will have to know the outcome of your negotiation for them to be able to make decisions, so they know that those resources will be available when they need them. So this outcome this criteria is looking for you to evidence that you are communicating the outcomes of your negotiations to the relevant stakeholders. For this, reflect on a time where you were involved in negotiation. What was the outcome of your negotiation? To what extent did it go well? What was the outcome from it? How did you document that? What might you have done differently? And how did you communicate the outcome and the result of your negotiations with relevant stakeholders? Product evidence for this would be communication, actually communicating that information to your stakeholders. Could be project reporting on negotiations, or it could be a report evaluating how well the negotiations went. 3.5, evaluate the process and outcomes of negotiations against plans and expectations, making recommendations to address departures and shortfalls. This one's quite similar to 3.4. This is very reflective though on the success or failure of your negotiations, identifying what you might do differently. So if something didn't go to plan, you're reflecting on what didn't go well, what caused it not to go well, and what would you have done differently going forward. For this, reflect on a time where you've been involved in negotiating. What was being negotiated and who was involved? What was the outcome of the negotiations? What was the procedure outlined for recording and communicating the negotiation outcomes? How did you record communication outcomes? How do you communicate these to relevant stakeholders, and who were your relevant stakeholders? Product evidence for this could be an updated communications management plan, a document or report about negotiation, digital communications, sending a report to stakeholders. It is important that this is communicated out though, so if you've got some sort of report, ideally you want it to be something which is communicated out as well. So 3.4 and 3.5 are quite similar. Thanks for listening, and hopefully this helps you gather evidence towards this unit.